How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be joining your IG Live
Thank
at a
you.
really important time as well. I think we're going to have a really important conversation, something that's often overlooked. And I think that the more we can unpack this relationship between the regime in Iran and Hamas, the better we can understand this conflict and what's driving it.
I could not agree with you more. And it seems like part of the conversation that is peripheral, right? Like you're hearing references to the Islamic Republic of Iran throughout some of these, some of the coverage. And I think we haven't really explicitly tried to explain it. And I get questions about it all the time, obviously, have being Iranian. And, obviously this has been like such a heartbreaking and scary couple of weeks. But I also think it's been so confusing and frustrating to so many people because they're just being bombarded with so much misinformation and so much propaganda and bots and trolling. And I do think there are so many questions around how Hamas was able to plan and execute a terrorist attack on this scale, and also how Iran and Hezbollah fit into this. And I also wanted to say at the top of this conversation, and I think, I may prompt you throughout to just explain certain terminology.
Absolutely.
But I just, again, I say this with all love, like when we talk about Iran, we are talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are never talking about the Iranian people. No. And I think there is the Iranian people absolutely do not stand for the brutality of this regime, and they have been protesting against them for a year now. They've been very supportive, and so again, there is a distinction that we will be drawing throughout
Absolutely.
this. But when we're saying Iran, this is for everyone who's listening, and we'll see this later. We are really talking about the regime. So maybe we can dive in, and I may prompt you again throughout just to. Can you? I mean, this is the biggest question, but can you maybe share a high level overview of how Iran has helped fund and was involved in the planning of this attack, and from your perspective, what you think it seeks to gain?
Absolutely. And I think the distinction that you made, first and foremost, is a really important one. And I want to make this absolutely clear from the offset as an Iranian as well. The people of Iran stand with the people of Israel, and they face the same existential threat as the people of Israel, and that is the Islamic Republic, the regime. They have been protesting on the streets, not only obviously in the past year, but consistently for the past 44 years. And it's taken new form of protest that really began 5 years ago, that was clearly anti-regime. So people are risking their lives, and they truly do understand the scale of the threat. And I think that the people of Israel, the Jewish community more broadly, and the people of Iran stand united against the threat of the Islamic Republic. So to answer your question, I think it's really important to take a step back to understand and unpack the relationship between the regime in Iran and Hamas. And when we're talking about the regime in Iran, particularly, we're talking about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps here, who handles the terrorism portfolio primarily. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is a violent Islamist extremist organization that has a constitutional mandate, according to the 1979 Constitution of the Islamic Republic, of an ideological mission of jihad in God's way, to spread Sharia across the world. Now, inside of Iran, that has meant that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has acted as the clergy's primary enforcer of this hardline Islamist extremist order in Iran. Externally, it has meant that the IRGC is the principal force tasked with exporting the Islamic Revolution, with the idea of creating an Islamic state that will one day facilitate the return of the so-called hidden Imam Mahdi. And we can go into that because it's very relevant to the ongoing attacks now, particularly when we're talking about doctrines and propaganda. But the relationship between the IRGC and Hamas really started to flourish in the early 1990s, when Israel expelled Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to Lebanon. When they were in Lebanon, when PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas were in Lebanon, they underwent training at the Hezbollah University, and this included training for suicide attacks. But not only that, we saw that Hamas militants, a contingent of Hamas militants, were sent over to Iran, to Tehran, to undergo ballistic missile training and missile training overall by the so-called godfather of the Iranian ballistic missile program, and that's IRG commander Tehrani Moghadam. As well as that, we have seen that Hamas officials on record state that the IRGC very, very quickly is the force that has created this underground smuggling network across Gaza. So the masterminds behind this underground smuggling network, which facilitates illicit funds to Hamas, illicit missiles, etc., weapons, that is all part of an IRGC strategy. So the IRGC really is at the forefront of this, and its ties to Hamas are incredibly deep, driven, by the way, while Hamas is a Sunni Islamist extremist group and the IRGC is a Shia Islamist extremist group, the glue that binds these two extremist organizations together is their official policy, which is eradicating the state of Israel. So anti-Semitism is at the heart of this relationship.
Okay, that was so helpful.
There's a lot together.
Okay, so they have, what do you think the budget is, by the way? Like, how much is Iran spending annually on this?
Sure. So annually, it was estimated around $100 million per year. However, in the past year, we have seen an increase in funds being made available to Hamas, which has risen up to 350 million. Now, a lot of your viewers may say, well, 100 million, 350 million, they're relatively small numbers when we're talking in military terms. But we're not talking about conventional military here. We're talking about a terrorist organization. Yeah. You give a terrorist organization $350 million, that's a lot of money for terrorism.
That's a lot of money. And they have like training. So what you're saying is that there's like actual training facilities in Iran where they are training terrorists and they are arming them with this sole.
There are IRGC bases, paragliding bases that were used to train Hamas terrorists for paragliding, which was essential to the terrorist attacks on October 7th. As well as this, we've got a coordination and orchestration base to coordinate and orchestrate attacks on Israel, on the border of Israel in southern Lebanon. And that's a joint control room that is headed by the IRGC. You've got Hezbollah officials there as well, and you've got Hamas officials. And that coordinating base, by the way, started in 2021. So since 2021, they created this base to coordinate these attacks more closely. So bringing Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and IRGC together in a room where they could orchestrate and plan attacks.
Okay, this might sound like the dumb question, but I think it's important. Like, why? Why Israel? Like, why? I mean, it's like it's the smallest country. Like, what is the existential threat that Israel presents to the Islamic Republic, and to organize so much effort around this? And then maybe we can get into the context around Israel and Saudi Arabia and the peace agreement, all of those things. But I just like to say this goes back for so long. Maybe if you can explain why.
Well, this, goes back to the longest form of hatred that exists in the world, anti-Semitism. It's rooted in anti-Semitism, Islamist ideologies, Islamist extremist ideologies. And when we're talking about Islamist ideologies, we're talking about not Islam as a religion, we're talking about Islamist ideologies, religion turned into a political ideology that is then expanded violently as well, with the idea that an Islamic state must rule. This is rooted in deep anti-Semitism. The conventional Islamist view is that Israel is a colonial state that was created by the West to carry out its colonial operations in the Middle East and the region, but also around anti-Semitic Jewish conspiracy theories that state that there is a global conspiracy going back really to the elders of Protocols of Zion, which is the manual, if you like, for extreme anti-Semitism. So that's the conventional view, but I want to actually take it towards a new form of hatred, which is in a sense even much more existential. And I've monitored this through the indoctrination program of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, based on original internal IRGC manuals that I've got my hands on and researched. From 2009 onwards, the IRGC's doubled down on this concept of the militaristic doctrine of Mahdiism. Now, the militarist doctrine of Mahdiism, and this is going to be a bit theological, but I'll try and unpack it in simple terms. This idea is that the Islamic Revolution in 1979 was a starting point for the return of the hidden Imam. The hidden Imam, who Shias believe was withdrawn into a miraculous state of occultation or disappearance in 874 AD. Now, in 1979, you had the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the clerics in the Islamic Republic stated that this was the starting point for Mahdi's return. Now, from 2009 onwards, the IRGC started to communicate and indoctrinate its recruits by stating that to make Mahdi reappear, the IRGC had to remove the barriers for Mahdi's arrival based off historic Shia narrations. These date back centuries.
Yeah.
Now, they have been communicating and indoctrinating their recruits and stating that the biggest barrier to Mahdi's return is Israel's existence and the existence of Jews in the world. Now, from 2009, you see that being incorporated severely in the IRGC's indoctrination program. So recruits are being radicalized on this notion with the belief that the IRGC and its proxies are the military vehicle to speed up Mahdi's return. So what we're talking and what we're seeing today, this is the biggest, in my view, and most existential threat to the existence of the state of Israel, because you have a cult of Mahdiism in the IRGC and across the proxies that believe Israel's existence is the biggest barrier to Mahdi's return. And for Mahdi to reappear, Israel needs to be destroyed. According to Shia narrations, when this happens, there will be an apocalyptic war, there will be rivers of blood, the Jews across the world will be eradicated, and then we'll have the end of times, and so-called justice will be restored across the world. So in a sense, this has become, this hatred for Israel, this extreme anti-Semitism has become even more threatening, even more extreme. And why is this relevant today? As we speak right now, on Iranian state TV, across the Middle East where the proxies are active, Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, in Syria, they are communicating this attack on Israel as being a sign of Mahdi's reappearance becoming closer. So they're doubling down on this narrative, which makes it extremely, extremely dangerous. I have to emphasize that you're talking about young men who have been radicalized to their core, no different to the likes of ISIS, Al-Qaeda. This really is a violent Islamist extremist ideology that has potential to escalate in a way that could be the most destructive thing for global stability, world peace, and of course, the existence of the state of Israel.
Wow. That is really unbelievably terrifying. And this is coordinated, right, around the Middle East and very, very well funded. So I know we threw out some numbers for what the funding is for Hamas, but I mean, when you think about all the other terrorist cells and organizations that are being funded from Iran, it seems like Iran though works through proxies, right? Like they're working, they establish the agenda, they fund these terrorist groups and try to organize this. Is this because they don't want to be brought into a war? Like why are they not owning what they're doing?
Well, it's the classic strategy that is at their core, which is plausible deniability. Now, the network of proxies they've created enables them to conduct terrorist attacks against their enemies whilst denying all responsibility, or with enough plausible deniability to prevent any consequences being imposed on the HQ in Tehran. It's also the way in which the nature of the Islamic Republic and the IRGC began as a violent Islamist militia. Even before the Islamic Revolution, the commanders of the IRGC were training with the PLO in Lebanon. So that militia identity is what shapes, it's to the core of the IRGC. In terms of strategy, but as you hit the nail on the head, it enables them to strike their enemies, conduct these attacks with enough plausible deniability to avoid any consequences. And until that exists, by the way, all the signs, even before this terrorist attack, we saw recent structural and doctrinal changes to the IRGC. I've written about this extensively, and all those signs indicated that they were moving towards confrontation with Israel. So what I saw on October 7th, although I was horrified by the level of the extreme violence that they conducted this attack, I think all the signs were there that they were moving towards confrontation with Israel anyway. But the plausible deniability enables the regime in Iran to avoid consequences being imposed on it by the West, by other powers, even though, as I said, it's quite explicitly clear that the Islamic Republic, not only the IRGC, had a role in green-lighting this attack, it would have had a key role in orchestrating it. And I think the Iranians, the regime knows that the West doesn't want confrontation with Iran, and it's flaunting that. It's going around there meeting with, today, this very day, Amir Abdullahian, the foreign minister of the regime in Iran, spoke with senior Hamas officials again. The fact that they feel as though that the West, what their calculus is that the West won't impose consequences on Tehran, is why they're flaunting this now, because they believe that, as I said, they can get away with it.
And that's disturbing on so many levels. And so then how did Saudi Arabia come into this? Because I know there were conversations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. We know that Biden's administration was trying to help broker some peace. There was so much talk that this attack and the timing of the attack was to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, Saudi Arabia, to the Islamic Republic, the regime in Iran's strategy has been the biggest thing that undercut this whole project the regime in Iran has for the Middle East is the Abraham Accords and peace between the Arab states and Israel. That really, really undermined their ideological project in the region. The fact that Saudi Arabia was moving towards normalization, and it seems that was picking up, was a huge threat to the regime in Iran, because it undermines their whole project towards hostility towards Israel, etc., etc. Now, even normalization that they had with this China brokered Saudi-Iran deal that restored relations, even then, and we wrote about this, on the surface, that appeared as though this was a good move for the region. You're getting the Iranians and the Saudis talking. But if you actually dig deeper and you unpacked Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, and the IRGC's motivations for restoring ties with Saudi Arabia, you realize this was never about Saudi Arabia. This was all about Israel and disrupting any form of normalization between Saudi and Israel. Now, this is another form, this attack was another means to disrupt that process of normalization. And I have no doubt that this is at the forefront of the regime in Iran's strategy. They had the regime in Iran, Raisi, the mass murdering president, the butcher of Tehran, who had a role in overseeing the murder of over 30,000 Iranians in the late 1980s. He had a phone call with the Saudis, with the Saudi leadership, just after this terrorist attack, and effectively made a veiled threat to the Saudis, stating, don't get involved. And the Saudis obviously do not want any confrontation. They're focused on Vision 2030, this modernization program, so they don't want to get caught in the crossfire. And I think they responded the way in which the regime in Iran wanted it to respond. But yeah, Saudi Arabia normalization is key.
So to me, obviously, it seems very clear and obvious, right, that Hezbollah and Hamas are so strategically close to Israel, right? I mean, Lebanon and Gaza are right there, which gives Iran like a strong presence in the area. Do you believe then, from where you sit, that this terrorist attack, what was the goal? Was it just to create chaos? Did it have anything to do with the liberation? I mean, they have not yet made a single request for anything from Israel. So do you think this had anything to do with liberation? Do you think this had anything to do, was this just to kill people? Was it to send a signal? Was it to further what you said? I mean, what was this?
Well, a number of things. And I think if we take a step back, firstly, we're not just talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. After with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, the regime in Iran, the IRGC, recruited and radicalized hundreds of thousands of young Shia men. You have the Fatemiyoun militia in Syria on the northern border of Israel. That's made up of more than 20,000 extremely radicalized Afghan Shia men that were recruited by the Revolutionary Guard. You have the Fatemiyoun militia made up of Pakistani Shia Islamists, again, recruited and radicalized by the IRGC. And across the region, the Revolutionary Guard not only has hard power assets, but it's got a soft power infrastructure designed to support the hard power assets. How do they do this? They recruit, radicalize, and deploy, use so-called charitable aid to do this. And we can talk about actually how they reconstructed Gaza with the goal of housing missiles and using civilians to protect Hamas missiles. And we can go into that later. In terms of the motivation, look, there are several motivating and driving factors for this. The first and foremost, it's this deep-rooted hatred for Israel, which is, a lot of people have denied this as, oh, it's just empty rhetoric. It's not empty rhetoric, and we're seeing that it's not empty rhetoric. The Islamic Republic has been spending millions, billions of dollars on arming these extremist organizations to the teeth and radicalizing them to their core to nurture and propagate extreme anti-Semitism. So a large part of this goes back to their official policy. The official policy of the IRGC is the eradication of the state of Israel and eradication of so-called Zionism. Now, you translate that, that's just hostility towards Jewish people and anti-Semitism. So a part of this was driven by that, and we see this, it's a part of a consequence of a project that Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, Iran's Islamic Republic, started in 2019 to so-called purify the regime and make it more extreme, make it perform better ideologically, because Khamenei is preparing, he's 84 years old now, he's preparing for a post-Khamenei Islamic Republic. He wants to sustain this hardline ideological vision. He's been doing that by purifying the ranks and empowering the most extreme ideological zealots. Another factor was to mobilize and create better coordination, but with the so-called axis of resistance, the so-called ring of fire strategy. So using conflict to consolidate this proxy network and give it the upper hand. Part of the reason why now, again, we've discussed this, the Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization, the changes to the internal system of the Islamic Republic, but also they've been monitoring what's going on inside Israel, and they've seen that in Israel there's kind of disagreements, there's internal and domestic instability, which they believe they could leverage and catch the Israelis off guard. Now, if you take a step back, if you were in the Beit Rahbari right now, in the Supreme Leader's office, if you were in the IRGC Central Command headquarters, you would assess what's gone on and your objectives. And I think that they would be very happy with what they've achieved so far. Let's not forget, these are violent Islamist extremist terrorists. So they feed off this destruction. And there's a big ideological underpinning to all of this, as we've discussed. That makes this extremely lethal. Now, if there aren't consequences imposed on Tehran, we can expect to see this escalation continue. Even if this round of this conflict kind of settles, expect the IRGC to continue this. It's prepared itself and its proxies to continue this long, what it sees as a long war.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, and can you maybe just go back a second and explain how they have used Gaza and the funding that they've put into Hamas to create this underground network?
Sure. So if we take a step back and look at the context, but after the 33-day war in southern Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel, the IRGC mastered its so-called reconstruction plan. Now, what happened was you had these charitable organizations called the Reconstruction Committee for Lebanon, headed by IRGC Quds Force Commander Hassan al-Shatari. And effectively, they use this entity, this charitable organization, so-called charitable organization, as a front to recruit radicalized young men who were kind of caught in the conflict in southern Lebanon, but also reconstruct Gaza, reconstruct Lebanon, with the goal of housing Hezbollah missiles, making it much harder for Israel to strike Hezbollah positions if there was a future conflict. They mastered this strategy in 2006. They tried to replicate that in Gaza with the Reconstruction Committee for Gaza in 2008. This was an IRGC plan to rebuild civilian buildings, homes, schools, hospitals, mosques, in such a way to house missiles, making it much harder for Israel to target Hamas terrorists. And what we're seeing today, right now, in Gaza is a consequence of this IRGC strategy that's often overlooked. As I said, we shouldn't only just look at the hard power assets, the numbers of missiles, etc. There's a whole soft power infrastructure they've created that facilitates and supports this hard power asset. So there's a foundation that they've built there that isn't per se military in the strict terms of the word.
I have a couple questions for you on that, but actually, like, maybe set the stage. What does success look like for Iran? Like, if all of the things that it wanted went through perfectly as it's planned, what happens? What's the vision?
Well, I mean, I'm of the view that, look, you've got the IRGC, where more than 50% of the IRGC's training is indoctrination. So more than 50% of the IRGC's training is radicalization. That's, we can't see, other than Islamist extremist terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, conventional militaries don't do this. And this goes back to the point that the IRGC isn't a conventional military, it's an ideological organization. Now, if you look at what they're focusing on as part of their indoctrination, they are communicating hostility towards Israel through this lens of Mahdiism. And I think we should definitely take their words. Yes.
But so then what happens? Let's say they destroy Israel. They're not going to stop. Like, do they want to control the entire Middle East?
Well, I don't think they can. Well, I don't think they can. Look, let's make it absolutely clear. They're not going to destroy Israel.
Of course not.
Because the IDF and the Israeli armed forces and the US and its allies will not let this happen. And I really think that we need to recalibrate policy towards Iran. But the point is, at present, the IRGC believes it is winning. At present, now they believe not only are they winning the war on the ground, terrorist attacks, by consolidating their proxy networks, they also believe they're winning the information war. They also believe they're winning the psychological war. And really, if you take a step back and look at the coverage of the terrorist attacks on Israel, which were unprovoked terrorist attacks, where we've got evidence of Hamas terrorists beheading children, burning people, raping women. All the evidence is there. Despite, we've got more than 200 hostages, children taken hostage among them as well. The international coverage isn't picking that up and is focusing more now on the Israeli response to defend itself. So from the IRGC's perspective, particularly when it's these rallies across Europe, particularly at these rallies, I'm not saying at these rallies everyone is a Hamas supporter, of course not, but it's mobilized the Islamist base in London, in the US, across Europe, where you've got scenes where people, hundreds of thousands of people, are stood alongside individuals carrying ISIS flags, Al-Qaeda flags, calling for jihad against Israel. The fact that this is going on from the IRGC's perspective, not only are they believe they're winning the battle on the ground through terrorism by causing terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians, they believe they're winning the psychological war. And, the West really has to come together, and the US has a key responsibility here to recalibrate its policy towards Iran and impose consequences directly on Tehran. Until you change the IRGC's calculus that there won't be any consequences for it in Iran, then unfortunately this escalation is going to continue.
Within 48 hours of the attack, there were some studies that were released showing that one in every four, so like posts online, were from bot farms and fake accounts that were pushing pro-Hamas propaganda. That seemed incredibly well coordinated and timed, right? Like, in my opinion, obviously pre-planned to coincide with the attack, which gave, the amount that they are, suppressing Israel content on X and other platforms is like appalling. But is this a new part of the strategy for Iran? Because there seems to be like a very, very big investment in misinformation and just creating mass chaos. I mean, when I look at my feed and the amount of hate that I get, it doesn't even feel real. Like there can't be this many people that are this crazy.
But you've got the IRGC's invested a lot of resource in its so-called psychological warfare doctrine, and it has created multiple divisions, cyber units, cyber armies, to both target for example, we saw this in the Women Life Freedom protests in Iran, to conduct psychological warfare operations through disinformation on the Iranian people. They're doing it now in the context of the terrorist attacks on Israel. There's no doubt that exists. We've also saw this, by the way. We've not taken this seriously, which I think is remarkable. We tend to take China regime disinformation, Putin's disinformation campaigns very seriously. And we've got task force across Europe, in the US, to address this and counter this. We don't have that for the Islamic Republic of Iran. We need that. And it's not just, by the way, this doesn't just play out in the Middle East. They played a very, very key role online to spread disinformation during the Brexit campaign, the Brexit referendum in the UK. Their goal isn't necessarily to take one side or the other. It's just to foment conflict and anger amongst Western audiences. They believe part of this strategy is so long as they're infighting amongst themselves, we have the upper hand. They did this in the US election when it was Trump-Biden, Hillary. Again, not taking a particular side, just fomenting infighting. They believe they can capitalize on infighting. We saw this as well. As I said, this was part of the strategy why they felt as though now was the right time to strike Israel, because we saw that there was a lot of domestic instability in Israel, and they believe that they could utilize that to their advantage. So there's all that. At the same time, what's been quite discouraging is even on mainstream international media, the reporting hasn't been accurate. The reporting has at times been one-sided, taking Hamas sources upon face value. The attack on the so-called attack on the hospital, which ends up being a PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad missile, was a prime example of this. And again, that plays to the IRGC strategy. It doesn't matter that now, as far as they're concerned in Tehran, now that multiple governments and intelligence services from Canada to the US, the Europeans have said, no, this wasn't an IDF attack. But as far as the IRGC is concerned, the damage is done. It's sown doubt amongst the people. So not only are we dealing with disinformation, coordinated disinformation from Tehran, but I think the international press coverage has been particularly poor. And I obviously understand that journalists have an extremely hard job, but not taking Hamas at face value is a start.
Today, the New York Times released like a fake apology for their horrible reporting on the hospital, and they wrote, "We relied too heavily on claims by Hamas." Like, is that news that you shouldn't listen to a terrorist organization? Like, did we?
It's insane. And what I think we don't realize is, and you will understand this, I see this in the UK, this has implications for the security of our citizens. This has implications for the Jewish community living in America. We've seen attacks on the Jewish community.
It is the highest it's ever been, by the way, since the 1940s when the ADL started monitoring it.
Absolutely. So the international press coverage has been particularly poor, and I think it's important that we set the record straight, and we do it by analysing the facts. And the idea, by the way, that the Islamic Republic of Iran was caught off guard by Hamas in conducting a terrorist attack on this scale is just ludicrous. And anyone making that argument either doesn't have an understanding of the IRGC and its relationship with Hamas, or is deliberately misleading, or a bit of both. And it's our responsibility to set that record straight and kind of take back control of that narrative.
Can I ask you how Qatar fits into this?
Yeah, it's really important. Very, very important question. I'm glad you raised that. I mean, look, Qatar is hosting and supporting senior Hamas leadership. Yet, last year, Qatar was made by the US a major non-NATO US ally. It was designated as a major non-NATO US ally.
Wow.
It has been funding and hosting Hamas the senior leaders of Hamas are residing in luxury hotels in Qatar. While the Palestinian people suffer, I mean, the Hamas doesn't care for the Palestinian people. That should be very, very clear.
It's
but
unfortunately not clear.
I know,
yes.
which is part of the problem. But to support terrorists is housing the equivalent of bin Laden in this current terrorist attack. You know, the current terrorist attack on Israel was Israel's 9/11 moment, and the Hamas senior leadership residing are equivalent to bin Laden, despite the fact that the US should make it absolutely clear that if this continues, there will be serious consequences imposed on Qatar, and that should include asset freezes. It should include the designation of Qatar as a state sponsor of terrorism. We saw Amir Abdullahian, the regime in Iran, the Iranian regime's foreign minister, after meeting with Hezbollah and Hamas officials in Lebanon, fly to Qatar and meet the masterminds, the Hamas masterminds of this terrorist attack. And they were kissing each other, hugging each other, and the Qataris were hosting it. I mean, we should not be tolerating this. We wouldn't have tolerated it with bin Laden. We shouldn't tolerate it with Hamas.
I'm sorry, just one minor clarification. Are they hiding in Qatar, or are they residing openly?
No, they're openly residing. They're openly residing in Qatar. You've got Hamas's most senior leaders residing in luxury accommodation in Qatar. And Qatar is very, very open about this, despite the fact that, you know, we see Qatar as an alleged ally, which I don't think it is clearly right now. It's harboring terrorists. It's obviously invested significant amount of money across Europe, across America. You know, the US has huge leverage here, and it needs to make a very, very clear message to the Qataris. If this continues, if you don't hand over senior Hamas leadership, we will impose asset freezes on your businesses. We will designate you as a state sponsor of terrorism because you're behaving no differently to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And there'll be serious consequences. No more business as usual. The Qataris have so far been able to obviously get away with this through the power of business. And I think that needs to be absolutely clear that the US should not tolerate this. We wouldn't have tolerated it with bin Laden, so we shouldn't tolerate it with Hamas terrorists.
And as far as the global response to something like this, do you have any sense of where the UK and France and Germany and like America's and Israel's key allies stand on this?
Yeah, I think the Brits, the Europeans have been very clear in their support for the state of Israel, which is good, obviously, but we need practical solutions here. And I think targeting the IRGC collectively, targeting Qatar collectively is important. That's what will have practical impact. That has the power to change their calculus. And you can only prevent this conflict and future conflict by changing these actors' calculus. So when it comes to the IRGC, for example, and we saw that recently, yesterday, the US has now encouraged Britain and other European nations to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. And just to give, again, very, very brief overview of the IRGC is a violent Islamist extremist organization that operates no differently to prescribed groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. In its program of indoctrination, it openly calls for jihad against Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians on the basis that they, quote, have unacceptable faith and must either convert to Islam or be killed. Not only that, we're talking about the Iranian people here as well. They are teaching their recruits to not only kill Iranians who oppose the regime, but torture them prior to their death because they are, quote, enemies of God, Moharebs. In the recent round of protests, we saw young Iranian men and women being tortured and executed on the basis that they were Moharebs. So they're implementing this as well. So the US encouraging the European allies to prescribe the IRGC, that's a really important step that imposes consequences on the regime. targeting Qatari assets, which are everywhere. I mean, London is, Qatari money in London is everywhere. Same in the US, same across Europe. Making it very clear that if you don't hand over Hamas senior leadership to the US, to the Israelis, that your assets will be frozen and you will be treated as a state sponsor of terrorism. And finally, and I think this is a really important one, until the IRGC believes that the US and its allies have no appetite to hold it responsible and accountable for these terrorist attacks on Israel, it will continue the escalation. So even if this settles down, later on, it will continue this escalation. So you have to change that calculus. How do you change that calculus? Not only should the US strike IRGC proxy positions in the region, these are terrorist organizations, but also it should strike IRGC bases, assets inside of Iran. And let me make it very clear as an Iranian, targeting the IRGC is not war against the Iranian people or war against Iran as a nation state. It is targeting the very people, the very entities that are killing the Iranian people, that killed Mahsa Amini, that killed Nika, Mohammad Reza. The Iranian people share the same enemy as the people of Israel. That is an existential threat, and that is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And until consequences aren't imposed on the IRGC directly, unfortunately, this process of escalation, both against the Iranian people and against the Israeli people, will continue. So that needs to be on the table, very, very clear. If this continues, IRGC assets inside of Iran are legitimate targets.
I have one more question for you, and I cannot thank you enough for how generous you've been with your time. Israel has stated that their goal is to wipe out Hamas. It also, there was a statement from an Israeli minister of economy that said, Iran plans to attack Israel on all fronts. If they do this, we will respond not only on these fronts, but we will also reach the head of the snake, that is Iran. We're also seeing a global call for a ceasefire, demanding that Israel not pursue any on-ground efforts and to completely stop all efforts to bring down Hamas. What do you think would be the implication of a ceasefire and Israel not doing anything else?
Well, I mean, Israel has the right to defend itself. Let's just take a step back and go to 2001. Can you imagine after bin Laden conducting the September 11th attacks, the terrorist attacks, and then the US being told, you need to cease fire and not go after the terrorists? I mean, it's just untenable. I mean, it would be completely unacceptable, rightly so.
I also can't imagine at that time that people would go on the internet and blame the victims. Absolutely. So, I mean, the world is quite different when the victims are Jews.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with that. And what we've seen is the levels of anti-Semitism that we have seen, both online but also in person, has just been completely and utterly shocked and horrified by it. So Israel has said that it will take out the Hamas terrorists, and I think it has absolutely every right to do that, and it must do that, because if consequences aren't imposed on the terrorists, on Hamas, on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which is the godfather of terrorism in the Middle East. Yeah. If consequences aren't imposed, what happens is it doesn't get rid of the problem. It encourages the problem. It encourages them. What it does is it emboldens Hamas. It emboldens the terrorists. It emboldens the IRGC. The IRGC has prepared itself and its network of proxy militias for escalation. It believes it is controlling escalation. It believes it's holding the cards towards escalation because it feels as though no consequences will be imposed on it. So Israel, together with the US, together with its European allies, need to take back control. And the only way to do that, the only way to lead to a proper de-escalation in the region, is by imposing consequences on Hamas, on the proxies, on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. Until that doesn't happen, we can expect this trend of escalation to continue, and the bloodshed will continue. So anyone saying Israel must cease fire clearly doesn't understand the situation on the ground, or again, as deliberately choosing not to understand. But action needs to be taken. Consequences need to be imposed on the terrorists if we're true in wanting to stop this escalation and lead to broader peace and stability in the region.
Well, because there's hundreds of thousands of more that are trained and ready to come to surge and continue the terrorist attacks. So it's like, what?
Absolutely.
There is no ceasefire because they're not going to cease fire.
The whole in the past year, particularly, we have seen structural and doctrinal changes to the IRGC, all of which indicate that it's preparing for a major confrontation with Israel, and this confrontation is going to be consistent. They have rallied their ideological zealots across the Middle East and are openly stating that they are going to attack Israel on multiple fronts. And that's totally unacceptable. And Israel needs to send a clear message, which it is doing, but it needs, crucially, the support of the US and its European allies.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry to paint such a bleak picture as well. I mean, it's truly horrific.
It's so hard, you know, to understand like what this is and how these things all fit together and what the implications of them are. And so many people, you know, having opinions about this without understanding the full context. And I think there's something about like us Iranians who have seen what the Islamic Republic is capable of. Absolutely. That intuitively, I think we're like, we can see my parents call me, they're like, oh no, their handprints are all over this.
Absolutely.
Like we can see they're working behind the scenes, and we also know the brutality of them, and we also know that they will not stop. Like this is not
absolutely
a one time. This has been going on for so long. This is just like, this is not a one-time thing. When they are on like this mission, which is just bloody and horrible, they're not going to stop. And I don't know that people understand that context.
Absolutely. And we're
jumping into this conversation.
We really look. The reason when we understand this, that we're dealing with an ideological extremist, Islamist extremist state regime that is pursuing a violent extremist mission. This is a regime that is killing, murdering women for showing a bit of hair in Iran. This is a regime that is executing, murdering Iranian men and women for going onto the streets and simply demanding for a free and democratic system. This is a regime that kills, executes homosexuals. This is a regime that persecutes and kills and murders minorities. We shouldn't be surprised at how extreme and ideological these individuals are, because we see what they're doing in Iran, we see what they're doing in the region, and we really do need to take them seriously in the sense of we need to counter this threat and impose maximum consequences on this regime, because if they're not stopped, this process of escalation is going to continue. It's going to get much worse, and a lot of people are going to get killed. I think we have a responsibility to both speak out and also to work towards practical consequences and practical solutions.
Thank you. I may make you do this again with me soon. I will share this right now for anyone who joined late or wants to share this with other people. You were absolutely beyond brilliant, and I cannot thank you more. This context is so important in all of our understanding.
Thank you so much, Mandana. Honestly, it's obviously a pleasure to join. Again, apologize for painting such a bleak picture, but I think we need to have an understanding of the realities that are really difficult to take in. But the only way we can counter this and come together is by understanding the realities and collectively coming together to counter them.
I could not agree more. Thank you again so much.
Great. Thanks so much.
I hope to see you soon.
Likewise.
Bye.
Take care.